Hey guys, I hope you're doing well and having a good day so far today. We're going to finish up this unit today. So we're talking about our last two writers, James Weldon Johnson and T.S. Eliot. All right, so under the experimentalist. So let's talk about James Weldon Johnson first of all. He was a very, very gifted man. He was the first Black man after Reconstruction to be admitted to the bar in Florida, and that was his home state. He was did several different things. He wrote numerous songs. He served as United States consul to Venezuela and to Nicaragua after that. And he was a field secretary and general secretary for the NAACP in the 1920s. And then from 1931 until he died in 1938 from an automobile accident, he was professor of creative literature at Fisk University. So as I mentioned, he did a lot of things besides being holding those different positions as a consul and a secretary for the NAACP. He also was a critic, novelist, and poet, but especially remembered as being a poet. His work as a poet helped to lay the foundation for the Harlem Renaissance, it's called, of the 1920s. This was kind of the first major literary outpouring from Black American writers. He was kind of the leader of that, kind of laid that foundation, his work as a poet, for that movement. He's best remembered for his work, which is called God's Trombones. And it is a long work, so we're not going to read the whole thing. We're just going to look at one portion of it called The Creation. And it's a series of 7 sermons that were written in verse, in poetic form. And so we're going to start, it starts with creation and ends with the judgment day. So we're going to look at the creation today. I want you to notice a couple things as you look at it. Notice, and you'll want to know this term, anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism, that's a big word. What does it mean? It means depicting God as having human characteristics. So you're going to see him giving God some human characteristics in this poem, but you'll notice that even though he does that, he still retains the dignity in the situation. You don't feel like he's lowering God at all when he does that because of the way he does it. It still has a very reverent view of God while giving him some human qualities. And he uses a lot of biblical material in here. And so we'll look at this one. And actually, I have a recording that I'm going to play for you of him, James Weldon Johnson, actually reading this portion himself. So I hope that you enjoy that.
The creation is from my volume, God's Trombones, read at Columbia University, December 24th, 1935. James Weldon Johnson. And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side and the light stood shining on the other. And God said, that's good. Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun, and he set that sun a-blazing in the heavens. And the light that was left from making the sun, God gathered it up in a shining ball and flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and stars. Then down between the darkness and the light he hurled the world. And God said, that's good. Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, the moon was on his left, the The stars were clustered about his head, and the earth was under his feet. And God walked, and where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. Then he stopped and looked and saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over to the edge of the world, and he spat out the seven seas. He batted his eyes, and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands, and the thunders rolled, and the waters above the earth came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted, and the little red flowers blossomed. The pine tree pointed his finger to the sky, and the oak spread out his arms, and the lakes cuddled down in the hollows of the ground, and the rivers ran down to the sea. Then God smiled again, and the rainbow appeared and curled itself around his shoulder. Then God raised his arm, and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, bring forth, and quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. Then God walked around, and God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun, and he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars. He looked on his world with all its living things. And God said, I'm lonely still. Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river he sat down. With his head in his hands, God thought and thought, till he thought, I'll make me a man. Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river he kneeled him down. And there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand, this great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it he breathed the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen. Amen.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that, read in his own voice there. All right, let's look at our next person. Our last one we have here, T.S. Eliot, Thomas Stearns Eliot. Interesting story here. He was a very important figure in English and American literature during the middle third of the 20th century. He was the only major literary voice in the first two-thirds of the 20th century to speak in support of Christianity, right? Which that is an interesting thing, of course, during that time. We've talked about all these other poets and writers, and he was one that was a major voice that was heard, and he did support Christianity. His earlier years weren't anything too special. He did spend some time at Harvard and Oxford. He taught school in England for a couple years and worked at Lloyd's Bank in London. And he remained there until his death in 1965, even though his roots were American, but he just felt more at home in England. He actually became a British subject in 1927. And his important early pieces that he is remembered for would be the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and The Wasteland. And in both of these, he really portrayed how sterile the modern life is, and the how our lives have become so materialistic. And so he is critical of materialism and modernism and that kind of thing. And so in 1927, that year, he became a British subject, but something else also. There was a major shift in his life and his work. And from that point on, his works became more religious. And the poem that we're going to look at today is definitely a religious one called The Journey of the Magi. And this poem was during this time of transition, and it describes his conversion to Christianity. And so he uses this story of course, the wise men going to see the Christ child, but he also uses it to represent someone coming to Christ. All right, so it's kind of his story of coming to Christ. There is no other modern poet that has written a difficult verse that has stirred such an enthusiastic response from the readers. He was popular with general readers, even though his poetry was difficult. And for example, The Wasteland, it's quite long, and but he was very popular. So this one we're going to look at today, The Journey of the Magi. It was in contrast to the earlier things that he had written, like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and the Wasteland. This is very different than those. So this poem has meaning on at least 3 levels, and you see that in your head note, and you do want to be familiar with this thought. Okay, so first of all, it is a dramatic monologue, right? It's spoken by one of the wise men who came to see the Christ child. So that's kind of the first level of meaning there. The second level, according to many critics, is that it is a symbolic account of his own conversion to Christianity. And the third level is an imaginative portrayal of the journey of a soul from doubt and despair to spiritual life. So literal level is this the one of the wise men who went to see Christ. Okay, and then on a more figurative level is symbolic of his own journey to Christianity, and then on a more universal symbolic level would be a journey of a soul, right? Any man's soul from doubt and despair to spiritual life. So you'll want to know those 3 levels. That is a hint. You want to know those. Okay. So let's look at this poem. You want to know it is a dramatic monologue. And there are a couple things that I want to point out as we look through it, and the things that you are going to want to remember for the test. Okay. A cold coming we had of it. Just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels, galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Then at dawn we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky. And an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information. And so we continued and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon finding the place. It was, you may say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again. But set down this. Were we led all that way for a birth or a death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but I thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in this old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. All right, so a couple of things I want you to notice. The summer palaces on slopes and terraces. Okay, so obviously the literal meaning as the wise men were traveling, right? Thinking back to summer and wishing for the summer weather, okay? But let's go beyond the literal. Let's go to the figurative meaning. If we are talking about this as a journey from to Christianity, right? From doubt and despair, right? So summer palaces on slopes is symbolizing wealth and ease and a life devoted to just fulfilling desires and doing whatever you want to do. All right, symbolic of that. Hopefully, you noticed in line 24 the 3 trees on the low sky. Hopefully, you figured out that is alluding to Calvary, right? The 3 crosses. And then when the wise men are talking about, are we led all that way for a birth or a death? And of course, you and I know, right? Christ was born to die. The whole purpose of his birth was death, right? Was to die for us. And so he came to this realization, realizing that this birth is different, right? And then that last line there, I should be glad of another death. What do you think that means? When you read that line, what do you think? Okay, I have a couple of possibilities here. Talking about being glad of another death. Well, we are glad, right, that Christ died for us, right? So we're glad about that death. Or could also be meaning, I'll be glad of another death, meaning death to sin and death to self. Or could be meaning, I could be glad of another death, meaning I know that when I die, right, physical death, I'll be in heaven, right, with Christ. So it could mean any one of those things. Why don't you tell me what you think? Leave me a comment and let me know which interpretation you like to go with for that last line. But hopefully you kind of saw the literal meaning, but then also that figurative symbolic meaning, right, of a journey, right, from doubt to belief in Christianity to salvation in the spiritual life. All right, and that ends up this portion, this unit. So we will be having a test over this on Tuesday, and you have your study guide that you will be filling out. And then I will talk to you on Monday. We'll do a live classroom so we can talk about Silas Marner. Please make sure that you take the quiz before you join the classroom. All right, and I will see you Monday.